Hi guys, welcome back to Too Cool for Middle School. Today we're going to be talking about all of Ruta Sepetys' books. They are all historical fiction. I would give them all 5 stars. I think they're all really, really good, but I am going to rank them today just for fun, just to talk about, the different things that I like about each of them. You might be here because you are a teacher like me, or a historian like me, or just a lover of historical fiction like me. So I'm going to be kind of like incorporating the things that I like about each of them from a historian's perspective, from just a reader's perspective, and then, like how or if I would use them in the classroom as well. So we'll get into all of that. I kind of read them almost entirely backwards. I started with the most recent book that has come out, I Must Betray You, and I loved it so much. This was the first one that I had read of hers, that I ordered the collection in paperback of all of her other books, and I worked my way through, and I did kind of go backwards. I don't really know why. I just picked the ones that sounded interesting to me, like in that moment. There are, however, a couple that I would recommend reading in order. So you want to read Between Shades of Grey before Salt to the Sea, just because there's one character that like crosses over between the two books. So I think that would be useful. And then Fountains of Silence, read that one before I Must Betray You, because there's one other character in this world. It's completely different from these two, but there's one other character that shows up in this book and then later on in I Must Betray You. And then Out of the Easy so far is just standalone. Okay, so here we go, starting with number 5. And again, I still think this is a 5-star read. It's not that I don't like this book, it's just that I like all 4 of the others even better. Somebody has to be in last place. So for the slot of number 5, I'm going to start with this award-winning book, Salt to the Sea. Now, as a historian, I think this one is so important. I love how Ruta Sepetys writes history from the margins and gives us perspectives that we don't often see. So this book is told from the perspective of 4 different characters. One of them is a young Prussian man, one of them is a Lithuanian young woman, another one is a Polish young woman who is hiding her identity, and then there's a German Nazi kid. And it goes back and forth between all of their perspectives. Something that I just didn't really place in my mind about World War II was that Germany invaded Poland in 1939, I believe, and then just weeks later, Russia also invaded. So there were all these countries in Eastern Europe and the Baltic region, which we're going to talk about in another book as well, who were just being invaded by 2 huge evil superpowers, and they were displaced from their homes, they were refugees, and I really hadn't thought about that perspective very much. So I really appreciate this book as a historian. I learned so much and I think it's so powerful. As a reader, this one was a lot for me. This one really stayed with me in that I just felt despair while I was reading the book, and then that just stayed with me after. It doesn't really have much of a happy ending, because in real life there really wasn't much of a happy ending. Thousands of people die in this one specific situation that this book covers. I have a little 3-month-old baby, and most of the time while I'm reading, I'm holding her in one hand and reading like this. And it was really hard for me to read about babies dying in these situations and mothers trying to throw their infants onto a ship that was taking refugees, and the baby's hitting the side of the ship and falling into the water. That for my heart right now is just too much. And in the news right now, I've just been hearing a lot about Ukrainian refugees and women giving birth in these bomb shelters, and just knowing how hard it is to keep a newborn baby alive in the best of conditions, and just thinking about these women, it's really hard for me right now. So it's not an enjoyable book to read. It's really, really difficult. Again, the history, so important. The story, accurate, just really, really hard to read. And then as a teacher, I'm this is heavy. I don't I don't know that I would like assign this book as a whole class novel and make all of my students read about something so sad. It does, bring up important conversations about current refugees and what we should be doing to intervene and to help and, kind of look at models from the past. But I don't know. I think this one would give me pause. I don't know about forcing students to read something so traumatic for a grade. It's just knowing how it affected me. I'm sure there are also sensitive kids who would have a hard time with it. And then there's also kids who would really love this and be moved by it and be moved into action and moved into good, and that this knowledge would really arm them with compassion. And so I think that it's a good one to have available. And for some kids, this is going to be great. For others, it's going to be really hard. I just don't know. That's something kind of more new that I've been thinking about, because I used to just kind of want to shock my kids into empathy and just give them all of the most sad stories throughout all of history. And now I'm just, second guessing that a little bit, just because we're living through so many difficult things right now, and I just don't know how much is appropriate to pile on top of them. So something to consider with this one, but it is still really amazing. In fourth place, we have Between Shades of Grey, which I think is the first book that Ruta Sepetys published. And this one is kind of a prequel to The Salt to the Sea. So Joanna is mentioned a lot in this book, and then she's a character in Salt to the Sea. So this one is another book that, as a historian, I'm so glad that I read, because again, it gives us that history from the margins during World War II. There's so many historical fiction books about World War II, and we feel like we have read everything that you can read about World War II. We know all of these stories. But this one is specifically about a Lithuanian family, and Ruta Sepetys is Lithuanian, so some of this is based in her family history. So in this one, we have this similar situation of the Soviet Union invading these Baltic countries like Lithuania and just absorbing them into the Soviet Union, but then also making a list of people who they have decided are enemies of the Soviet Union. And so this family, because her father is a professor, anyone who is a professor or a teacher or a musician or anyone who they think could possibly think for themselves and stand up to the Soviet Union, is packed up. The men are separated from the women and children. They're sent to concentration camps, work camps. The women and children in this family are literally sent to Siberia. You hear that, gonna get shipped off to Siberia. They really did that to people. So this one, again, as a historian, love that this history is being written and being preserved for people to learn about. As a reader, again, this one is so hard. Again, there's a newborn baby situation in this one, and it's just so hard to imagine being separated from your family in this way. And again, I think that could be triggering for some kids if they have, been separated from their families by something that's entirely out of their control. But another thing that's interesting about this one that you just keep thinking is there's all these soldiers that have to do this. They have to go to these godforsaken places where they're forcing these people to grow potatoes and go to Siberia. And how awful, even for these very evil soldiers, but that many people agreed to treat these women and children and even the men as just less than human. You have to convince a lot of people to do that, to be this cruel, and go so far as to, take a train to Siberia with these people who are clearly not a threat, but you have to buy into this idea that they are less than human, that they deserve this, and you're gonna carry it out, and that makes you some kind of a hero. And I think that's where we have to really put our focus, maybe as teachers, okay, what are the ways that governments or leaders convince people that someone else, some other group of people, is less than human, less than deserving of life of freedom, and what happens when they are convinced to carry this out. So I think that is an important conversation. But again, this one is just like really dark because the history of it is really, really dark. And there are YouTube videos of the author like talking about her research and like the true stories behind these books. And I think those are super useful to incorporate if you do like teach these books in class. They're rough though, they're rough. It's just really hard to get through some of these stories and not like think about them constantly. But it is just so important to know because right now Putin is invading Ukraine, committing war crimes, and we know from his own admission that he wants to get back to this Russia of the Soviet Union. He wants to be like Stalin. And so when we know what Stalin did and how he killed, it's estimated about 20 million people, we don't have to guess like what Putin could be capable of because it just happened like a few decades ago, just like 2 generations ago. So it's really important that we know this history, but it's very tragic, and it is gonna, at the very least, gonna ruin your day. Like this is heavy and hard to sit with. Okay, book number 3, we're gonna switch to like a really different feel, a really different vibe with this book. I almost put this one as number 1, but then I decided to put it as number 3. I'll explain in just a minute. But this one is completely different from her other 4 books. This one I would say is mostly written for adults. It's not really definitely not like a middle grades book. Like I guess, you know, young adult, high school, it would be fine. It is largely set in a brothel. The main character is like 18, 19 maybe, and her mom is a prostitute who works in a brothel. That is her job. And then Josie, the daughter, doesn't want to do that, but she cleans the rooms and kind of works for like the madam. And it's all set in New Orleans. So I wouldn't say that this is necessarily a historical fiction novel. It's just set in the past. It's set in the 1950s in New Orleans, but it isn't necessarily based on like a specific historic event, but it's still really well researched. You can really like feel New Orleans. You know, she lives in the French Quarter and all that. I think this one is probably like her best written. The dialogue is great. The characters are really well developed. She just had some freedom to like write the plot because she wasn't having to incorporate such specific history. She was just incorporating more like culture and, you know, what it would be like for somebody at this time. This one is like a bit of a murder mystery. You know, there's also this girl like trying to get out of her situation. She's kind of trying to like improve her future through a college education, and we see like how difficult that is. And it's just really, really good. I literally read this in a day. I read all of this yesterday. I mean, you know, with a baby in my hand, but it's compelling, it's entertaining. It's really, really good. Kind of thinking it shouldn't be in my middle school classroom with like my 6th graders. It's not really appropriate for them, but again, as a adult, this is an excellent read. I highly recommend it to adults who understand that, you know, many people make a living doing sex work, and this is a book largely about that. Number 2 and number 1 were in such a close tie. It's really hard to even choose. I decided to keep these 2 like at the top because they are that like true historical fiction that you would expect from Ruta Sepetys. So I'm giving these 2 the top spots. They're so close. But for number 2, I'm going with The Fountains of Silence, which I just absolutely loved so much. I have another video where I go into this book a little bit more with some other books about the Spanish Civil War and Franco's regime. So again, this book is kind of written from the margins of World War II. Spain didn't enter into World War II because they had just had this horrific civil war, which started when a more liberal faction won an election, and then the conservative faction decided that the election was not legitimate, and so by military force they tried to take over power. So there was a civil war, and then Franco's fascist regime won and remained in power until like the 1970s. So this book is set during the 1950s, and the main character is an American kid, and he's like a senior, I guess. Most of the characters in all of these books are like 17, 18. So he's from Texas. His dad is like an oil baron type of guy. His mom's actually from Spain, so they go to Madrid for the summer. They stay in the Hilton. They're very rich, and so this book explores like how businessmen from the United States really enabled Franco during this time. He wasn't like an official enemy in the way that, you know, like Hitler and Mussolini were during World War II. We didn't fight against Spain, but their leader was doing the same things, some of the same things. You'll see that just like a lot of the crossover between these fascist dictators, they use a lot of the same strategies and do a lot of the same things to gain and keep power. We're going to see that in the next book as well. This one is a little bit more, it's a little bit lighter than, you know, like Between Shades of Grey and Salt to the Sea, because it's post-war, but we see the impact that the war has on even like the children of people who opposed Franco in the 1950s. And so you'll see that like the women are super oppressed in Spain, and everybody has to be Catholic and everybody has to speak Spanish. And so if you are Basque or Catalonian or just don't want to be Catholic or gay or anything like that, you are an enemy of Franco's. So this book is just really interesting because it does get into Spanish culture. We see like the coexistence of this fascist regime, and then like also a little culture and economy for American tourists, and a lot of American like artists and stuff would just like go to Spain and like vacation and live on the beach and just enjoy Spain, while so many Spanish people were being persecuted. It's really bizarre to read about that juxtaposition. So she does such a good job with that. And this one I really love because Ruta Sepetys puts so many primary source documents into this book. So every couple of chapters, you have one or two or three primary sources setting the stage for, you know, what's going on in the book. So she's not making this stuff up. This is the foreign policy of the US and the policies of Franco. So if I ever taught high school history, which I would love to one day, and if I taught modern world history, this would be a really, really useful resource, and I would love for my students to read it. And I just think that the Spanish Civil War is an important thing to study alongside World War II, as you're just looking at the rise of fascism, and it's something that we need to be keeping in mind right now in 2022. So this one is really important and also just quite enjoyable to read. Oh gosh, there's baby stuff in this one too, though, just like a pregnant woman's worst nightmare, and the church is complicit and all of this horrible stuff. I mean, so there's horrible stuff in this one too, but it is really good. Okay, I'm giving the number one spot to I Must Betray You. This is Ruta Sepetys' most recent book, and this one is set in Romania in the 1980s. And I might have like a special connection to this book because I've been to Romania. It was in like the early 2000s, I guess. It was like 2005 when I went, which is, you know, soon after their fascist regime falls. Because yeah, this one's set in 1989, so I was there like 15 years later. So this one has a more like narrow focus. It really takes place over just like a couple of weeks or months. It's not really this epic story like some of the others are. And again, this takes place in Romania under the regime of the communist dictator Nicolae Ceausescu. When I was there, we went into this enormous palace. It's the second largest building on Earth next to the Pentagon. Most of the Pentagon is underground, but this one is very above ground. And it's called, ironically, the House of the People. But Ceausescu just stole the entire country's resources for himself and just built himself this palace. There's details at the end. I actually always start at the end of all of these books. Like I want to read the author's note and like the research notes and stuff like before I read the book, because I don't know, I always want to have that in mind. So like Ceausescu and his family had like gold plated dog bowls and just enormous wealth, while the people were starving to death. And that is what these dictators do. And something really interesting about this book is that it really shows how like informants just cause a society to crumble. So everyone in this book is afraid of everyone else because you're not sure who is informing on you. There's secret police that sometimes like force you to be an informant. So somebody might be informing just because they are trying to get like medicine for a sick family member because they wouldn't be able to get it otherwise. Some people, you know, are just like taking advantage and they want to work with the government. And so it just like cripples a society when you can't trust each other. Like as I was reading this, you know, as much as I hate all of the just like vile discourse in the United States between people on the left and the right, at least we can like have that open discourse. In Romania at this time, you could not ever speak out against the dictator, the government, or anything like that. And I think she just does a really good job of showing how crippling that is. Another thing that I really like about this book is how she does show that if you can't keep the military on your side, you can't keep power. And that's eventually what happens to Ceausescu. There's a huge uprising in the streets, not to give too much of this away, but this is just what happened in history as well. And Romanians come together against the one person who is oppressing them all. He is oppressing the military as well. So eventually, like, you have to realize, like, there are so many more of us than him, and turn on this horrible, horrible dictator. That's what eventually has to happen. The military has to stop working for him and, you know, come to this place where they have an identity with their people and not with the dictator. So that part was, you know, like more inspiring. Like there's kind of a happy ending at the end of this one, even though a lot of people die and it's a terrible situation as well, but like there's an overturning. So just as a reader, it helps to have that kind of closure at the end. Again, as a historian, love this one. I think it's so amazing. I knew a lot of this stuff just because I've been to like Timișoara and seen the bullet holes in the buildings that they talk about in this book and everything. So that was cool to see it in like a historical fiction form. And then as a teacher, I would definitely use this one again because it gives you so much to work with as far as talking about secret police and informants and, you know, how that just destroys a society. And there's also like an American diplomat in this book who is also a character from The Fountains of Silence. But, you know, also just thinking about like Americans were just like chilling during this time. We were just letting all of this happen. Either we didn't know or we just didn't care. Like our leaders were meeting with the leader of Romania and just like hanging out. There's a little piece about that Romanian gymnast who escaped and never went back. Natalia something, I forget, but just read the book and you'll see all about it. So love this one. Just in general, I really do love all of these books. I learned a lot from all of them. They all made me feel something as a reader, and there are at least pieces of all of them that are really useful if you are a teacher. So if you love historical fiction, you gotta get all of Ruta Sepetys' books. She's just like on top of the historical fiction world right now. If you're a teacher, these are all really helpful to you as resources. If you're a student, you really can learn so much about history that you're probably not going to just get out of your textbook. But again, that trigger warning that these are like, it's emotional to just read about people completely disregarding humanity and just treating other humans so despicably. It should affect you. It should impact you. It shouldn't just be easy to read through books like Salt to the Sea. So anyways, I would love to hear if you disagree. Let me know in the comments which one is your favorite, if there were any that you didn't get on with, if there are any that you're still hoping to read. I feel like on Instagram anyway, people have pretty strong feelings about Ruta Sepetys' books, so I would love to hear from you in the comments. And also if there's another kind of history from the margins type of story that you wish somebody would write about, also put that in the comments, because I swear a couple of weeks before I heard about this book, and it hadn't even been published yet. It was just like, oh, hey, here's gonna be a new book. I had said, like, someone needs to write a historical fiction book about Romania. I wanna know more about that history. And I put that out into the universe, and then a few weeks later, this one existed. So put that out into the universe. So thank you for being here. Thank you for watching this video, and I will see you in my next one. Bye.